Right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the meeting of the Audit Committee. It's gone 2 o'clock, so I'm going to start. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence. Can you just let us know who we got?
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillor Murphy and Councillor Clark.
Thank you. Declarations of interest, I can either take them now or we can take them as we go through the agenda if appropriate. Okay. Public open forum, there don't seem to be any members of the public present, so I imagine there are no questions under that item. Okay, can I just at this stage just check who we've got here who are not councillors? We've got a new secretary on the right here, so if you just tell me your name and then we'll just go through officials.
I'm Richard Williams, Democratic Services Officer.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Joy Robson, Head of Finance.
Andrew Wathen, Chief Internal Auditor.
Julie Boothroyd, Head of Adult Services.
Welcome.
Anthony Ford, Wales Audit Office.
Right. Anyone else who wants to make themselves present?
Kelly Byrne from Enterprise.
Welcome. Hello. Okay. Well, I know that Kelly, who's here specifically for the issue of the questions we were asked last July, is only able to stay with us for a short time. So what I'm proposing to do is to go onto the action list and then come back to the minutes after that, if that's acceptable. Yes? Okay, good. And the first action list point I want to take, I'll just scroll down to it. It's about the MCC response to issues raised by a member of the public on the 16th of July. Now, I understand there has been a reply made to the people who are making these inquiries. Can you fill us in on that, please?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much, Chair. Just to clarify, what I've done for today is just put together quite a short response to some of the issues that I know were made known to this committee back in July, August time of last year. Now, recognising very much that when the Member of Public came along, he actually put some issues to Audit Committee for your consideration and response. But separate to that, there was also another letter, a collective letter, which raised many of the same issues. So I know now that those have been responded to. But what I was hoping to do today was to talk you through some aspects of a suggested response so that you can consider it and then you can make your thoughts and feelings known and perhaps follow up on any matters that you see as needing to be progressed. Would that be okay if I just outline some of those areas? I'm not quite sure how you want to go about that, Chair.
Well, if I could just interrupt there. You've sent me some information just this morning,
That's
which
right.
committee members will not have seen. I wondered whether it was would be most appropriate if, for example, if the committee were able to see what the reply was, what the official reply was, and we could look at that alongside your notes, and then we could debate that at some future point. I just feel that you will give us a lot of interesting information now, but we won't be able to give you a considered response to it. So how do you feel about that?
Okay, Chair, yeah, I'm absolutely fine. I've circulated that response to you. I'm happy to do it to wider members of the committee. It's obviously very confidential at this stage because some of the sensitivities and some of the personal matters cited within that. But my response is one that I've collated with the relevant departments for you, for Audit Committee. The questions posed by the member of the public were actually to Audit Committee for a considered response. So what I've tried to do is to give you some thoughts, some feelings, some facts, some evidence so you can consider if those are the kinds of things you'd like to get back to that member of public with by way of a response.
I think my concern is that the committee would need to, have time to absorb the information and decide what to do with it. Yes, Councillor.
Yes, I take on board what the officer's saying because we're all about checking governance here, aren't we? That the procedures are being applied in the right way. As to the individual content, I don't know how much relevance we need to go down that route on. We need to assure ourselves that the right people are answering the right questions in the right forum. So I think that's what we need to chase as opposed to trying to identify the individual.
So what I'm envisage happening is that you might turn this into, well, essentially a formal paper to the committee, giving us the response that's been sent, which I presume is not confidential, plus information that can be made public. But you just mentioned things in there that were confidential, and I'm just wondering, you know, do the committee need to know that information? And if so, what would be the proper protocol for us seeing it if it wasn't to be published?
I think on the
Chairman,
Yes,
are we are
Councillor.
live streaming?
We are.
Yeah, so in relation to the confidential items, I think we need to be careful on that.
absolutely, and
Yes.
my response is very high level. It doesn't get drawn into the detail of sensitive matters, but I believe it's sufficient in informing an appropriate response for your consideration. So what I can do is quite happily convert the response that I've sent to you, Chairman, into a high-level report that addresses the issues and the actions that have been undertaken. You can then consider them, and then simultaneously you can decide if that's something that you want to take forward and give a formal response to that member of the public, or perhaps invite them to a meeting when it is being discussed so that they can see the paper and we can have the discussion at the same time.
Would that be acceptable to the members of the committee? Okay, so we're looking forward to a formal paper to the committee for next time. Right, thank you very much for that. Okay, anything else on that? No, good. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, it's perfectly sensible. While we're on audit committee actions from previous meetings, the first one on early departures and vacant posts, we had information in detail about that from Mr. Davis at the last meeting, but it only came, I think, on the morning of the meeting, so we decided to postpone it. Now, I know you've all seen it now, but I'm sure that was your holiday reading between now and last time. Do you have any, are there any particular points you committee members wish to make now? And I actually understood from Mr. Davis that there was going to be someone here to fend any questions on that, but I don't think we've got anyone, have we?
I don't believe we do have
No. So if any questions are raised here, they can be put into the minutes, I think. If you wish to. Yes, Councillor Petrini.
I have several questions, Chairman. Is it worth me asking them now, or?
The only slight difficulty I've got about this is that although it looked like a formal paper that we were given last time, it's never been put with the papers of the audit committee. So we'd be discussing something that the public haven't seen, which is a bit awkward, really. And I guess if I was to be a stickler for protocol, I'd be asking Mr. Davis to submit it as an official paper for next time. I'm disappointed that there's no one here from that section. It would have been not Mr. Davis, because he's on a different project now, but it would have been someone else. I wonder whether the correct thing for me to do is now write to Mr. Davis, ask him to put that paper up as a formal paper to the audit committee next time, and then we can discuss it, hopefully with an officer present. Views on that, please. Yes, Councillor.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate, Chairman. I'm prepared to move that be done.
So if Councillor Petrini is happy to leave it there so that you can question the officer next time, we hope. Yes, Councillor Easton. Councillor Easton, have you got your microphone switched on? Because you're not coming over very clearly.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst we're deliberating whether to move papers on to a next meeting from another meeting, I'm rather concerned that these two issues have been rolling around for quite a long time. How many more times are we going to move things to another meeting? We've had the officer come here with a sort of report and has gone out to give us a formal report, which I think should have been put before us today. We met Peter Davis on a number of occasions. He was going to provide information. Yes, he provided information by an email. It hasn't gone on the agenda. I don't think it's appropriate for this committee. I don't think it's appropriate this committee should be treated in the way it is. I believe that papers should be sent promptly so we can digest them properly. We're talking now 6, 7, 8 months gone by. I think it's inappropriate.
I share your frustration, Councillor Easton. I would appreciate it if your comments were written into the minutes. It doesn't happen It doesn't happen that often, I don't believe, that papers are rolled over from one meeting to another. I think we've got a couple of... One frustrating example, because of the length of time it's taken to deal with the queries from members of the public. I feel that the early departures and vacant post information, that has been rolling on a long time, but we have been asking further questions of the appropriate officers as the meetings have gone by. But I agree with you that the committee does deserve the proper respect, and that papers should be put up on time, and that officers should attend to deal with them. Councillor Petrini.
My concern is, I mean, I support it becoming a formal paper and we wait another 6 weeks, but then we always get the classic response when you ask questions is, oh, well, this paper's out of date, or that information's out of date, we've done X, Y, and Z, and then you think, you think to yourself, why have I bothered reading this? Why have I bothered analysing it? Why have I bothered asking questions when I get it 8 months later? Now my questions are just battered off with, oh, well, this is out of date. Well, yeah, it is out of date because we haven't had the paper still for 8 months.
I wonder if I could suggest whether, if members do have questions on that paper that was circulated previously, they could let us have those questions, so that when Peter drafts something for your future meeting, that those questions are answered in the paper, hopefully, or you can address those issues, so that we're not constantly rolling it on and on and on. Maybe that would help move things forward.
Well, there's a suggestion. I think essentially, Councillor, that you would write to Mr. Davis, and as the author of that paper that you've already seen, and copy me in. But my request to Mr. Davis will be to come back to us.
Chair, I mean, as the councillor obviously has his questions ready, we could hear the questions now so that we can chew on those, and when the meeting does come about, we know what it's all about.
If we feel that's appropriate, as I said before, I'm a bit concerned that anybody watching this meeting on live streaming or looking at the papers that have been published won't have that information that Mr. Davis gave us. I mean, to some extent, this does happen offline when we ask information from an officer and they provide it to committee in between meetings. So it's partly one thing and partly another. But I don't know if that's what the committee wants to do. We'll record Mr. Petrini's questions and put them into the minutes. Do we agree?
Chair, it might be appropriate that when officers do reply in between meetings, that the agenda for the following meeting should have those questions and responses, just to remind members here, but it would also enlighten members of the public of what questions have been asked and what replies have been given by officers.
I think that's a good suggestion, yes. What do you want to do, Councillor?
I'm happy to ask them. I mean, I'm not greatly complicated.
Well, okay. If you were to tell us what those questions are, then that does enable the rest of the meeting to think about it as well. Is that okay?
Okay. So on the paper then, 3.8A talks about why some vacant posts have been held, and A says that they've been held to basically offset budget pressures. And then I've gone through the appendix, and it's not clear that many of them, how many posts have been offset by budget, to offset budget pressures. A lot of them seem to be waiting for advertisement. Now, can I just have that confirmed, basically? Is it that very small numbers of vacant posts have been used to offset budget pressures? Or a kind of a concrete number of how many posts have been used to offset budget pressures would be preferable. And on 6.11, which is right into the I think it's appendix maybe, or past the report as it were, talks about how many jobs have been lost, compulsory or voluntary redundancies by wage band basically. And I appreciate that the majority of staff this council will employ will be below £40,000. But it looks like from just on the face of it, predominantly the redundancies have fell upon people or employees earning below £40,000, actually predominantly on people earning below £20,000. I was wondering if we could get more perspective on that in terms of proportionality, in terms of grades, to kind of get a greater feel of, in percentage terms, how many by banding how many staff have been lost on in comparison on been lost on below 20,000 in comparison to say above 60,000 in proportional terms.
Just to clarify, proportionate to the number of people in post still. Yeah.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Well, I'll endeavour to make sure that's drawn to Mr. Davis's attention. Okay, thank you very much for that. And the third item we've got coming up as Audit Committee actions is we had an unsatisfactory audit opinion on Monmouthshire Enterprises, and I believe Mrs. Boothroyd is here to provide a response to those, to give us some information as a result of that internal audit report. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just by way of context, I think it's just worth explaining that this particular service, the Monmouthshire Enterprises, for those members who do not know, it's not actually known as the Monmouthshire Enterprises anymore. It's actually known as Tudor Street, My Day, My Life.
Excuse me, Julie, can you turn your microphone on, because otherwise there'll be no
Thought I had.
no record of what you say. So,
It's on, but it's not working.
oh, right.
It's got flashing lights, but it's on.
Oh, could you try the next one?
It was on, we just the camera focused on it.
But no sound. Can you hear me now? Yes,
Yes.
you can. Fab.
Yes,
Okay.
you'd better start again.
I will. I'll start again. Just by way of a bit of context, Monmouthshire Enterprises is not the name of the service now. It's actually known as Tudor Street, My Day, My Life, for members who perhaps are in the Abergavenny area will know. I think it's fair to say that over the last 4 years or so, we have been remodelling that service as a result of a rather large-scale investigation which has concluded and has actually been through Adult Select Committee. The Development Fund, which was one aspect of the unsatisfactory audit report, was a fund that was set up when it was known as Monmouthshire Enterprises. And in lots of ways, that service was way ahead of its time in that it was looking to deliver employment opportunities for people with learning disabilities. However, the way in which that service was set up actually became unsatisfactory, and hence why we carried out an investigation. Whilst we were carrying out that investigation, there was a lot of staffing issues, there was lots of remodelling and refocusing of that service. And what we did right from the start was actually freeze that account and left it. It wasn't actually working anymore. And it took some time to get to the point where that was then, you know, we got to that point of the piece of work to be able to say, right, how are we going to discharge this? And in lots of ways, it took a lot longer than we would have anticipated, and hence the audit report that reported that it was unsatisfactory. That development fund now, in terms of the note that I passed forward, the balances are now ready to be redistributed, and it's all been sorted. So as far as I'm concerned, as head of service, we've done the piece of work that was required. It's now no longer. I'm sure if Andrew was to come back and do that audit now, it would not be. It wouldn't be unsatisfactory anymore. With regard to Swancraft Studio and the issue around the lease, arrangements for and around the sale of goods. Again, Swancraft Studio, for those members who know the Monmouth area, is actually a shop front premise in a little arcade. Where a number of our people, both with physical disabilities and learning disabilities, actually go and partake in craft activities and such like, and actually do, in effect, sell some of those things. There was an issue about the goods in terms of what was being sold, how it was being monitored, how it was being apportioned. That's now actually been scaled down considerably. And in relation to the lease, which was one of the questions around the audit, currently we are looking to secure a future accommodation base, which actually would suit both the lease arrangement and our service development a lot better. That's not finalised yet, but it's definitely in progress. There was an issue about insurance and the arrangements for safes and goods at Swancraft. That's now in place. And the realignment of the budgets as a result of the investigation and as a result of us having to reorganise a number of those services have now happened. So from my point of view, I feel reassured, and I'm hoping that members will feel reassured, that even though it's taken some time to get to the point where those things have been signed off and satisfactorily delivered. That's the position that we are in at the moment. Is that okay, Chair?
Yes, it's up to members of the committee to have any further queries or questions for you. I throw it open to the meeting.
It does appear that the recommendations have been addressed and that the shop is now in order. So let's hope it continues that way. And I think the action is completed, Chair.
Anything else? Well, okay, then all I can do is... Oh, yes, Mr. Wathen.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to reassure members as well, thanks for the Head of Service to come along today and give us some updates of where we are in terms of the procedure. As members will be familiar with our process, it was deemed to be unsatisfactory at a point in time. It sounds as though things have moved forward, which is really reassuring. It will be incorporated within our planning process for 16-17, so at some stage we'll go back and we will follow up the work and just cross-check with Julie and her team that things have been addressed, and we can feed back to members accordingly.
So I'd just like to thank Mrs. Boothroyd for coming along today. Thank you. Right, well, I think that wraps up the action points that we had from previous meetings. So we can now go back to the minutes of the previous meeting. I did have a note on this. There we go. Right, I just wanted to say about the minutes of the previous meeting that, I mean, I had hoped that the minutes would have conveyed the report of the Passenger Transport Unit Manager more fully. He gave us a lot of information in that meeting, some of which has been passed on to members of the committee, but obviously not on in the form of an official paper for the agenda or for the record of the meeting. Now, I suppose what I really want to know is the meeting content with this? Or should we ask the passenger transport unit to put that response into a more formal paper, which we can then put on the agenda for a future meeting, but it would be essentially for information only, since the information has already been provided to us and we had a chance to ask questions of Mr. Cope. So that's what I'm suggesting, and see whether the committee agrees with that.
In relation to to go back to the action list and what we decided on that, I think it's appropriate that that's done.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I shall endeavour to do that then and ask him to put that into a more formal paper. Okay, so is there anything else on the minutes of the previous meeting?
Prepared to move them, Chairman.
Agree with that? Okay, thank you. Oh, was that a second from Councillor Edwards? Yes, thank you. So we're going to move on to the report from the Welsh Audit Office and also, I believe, with the cooperation of MCC, Certification of Grants and Returns 1415. Actually, I don't know whether we got as far as you, Mr. Ford. You're Mr. Ford, aren't you? You're from the Welsh Audit Office, aren't you? But I don't know whether we got round to you when we were doing our heads up at the beginning.
Yeah, you did.
So, if you would like to introduce the paper, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. This is our annual report. You'd have seen something similar in previous years, and it just summarises all the work we've done on the authority's grants. You'd have read the report, but if I just draw your attention to some of the key themes coming out of it. This year, the Welsh Government made a small change in what they asked us to do, and that was to introduce the concepts of materiality. So in previous years, every pound was something we had to think about, that it was either right or wrong. Now we have £10,000 where it's the cumulative effect. You could have one over of £5,000, one under of £4,000, it's £9,000 of error. So that's just something we were grappling with this year, and I think how it played out, it just makes the comparison year on year a little bit tricky because we're comparing two slightly different regimes. But that's the context around the grants for this year. I think in the summary of it, there are 11 claims, 8 were certified with no problems, so that's an improvement on previous years. There were no claims qualified, and that links into where we had some issues below the £10,000. We provided a feedback note to Joy and her team that basically set out issues that we thought didn't need to be flagged to the Welsh Government, but were items that could just be reported internally with the council. Fewer amendments this year, and generally, I think an improvement the way grants were undertaken and managed, and better documentation. You'd have probably spotted the grants fees have been reduced, and I think largely that comes on the back of improvement across the board. Housing benefits is probably the big grant we audit, is more than 50% of the time. That's the fee, and that is down to less than 19,000, I think, from memory, which, if you remember, a few years ago, it was considerably higher than that. So that's something worth noting, that those arrangements work well. And the grants generally have come down across the board, although with our regime of charging, we have to break even on every piece of work, so there is a bit of volatility. A small bit of extra work on one claim will push it up one year, and you might not do that the next year. That's just the nature of the beast for grants. So there is a bit of volatility in the sort of the bulk of the grants, but overall the picture is one of reduced fees, which I think the council will note. There's also a detailed action plan in the back. There are a couple of minor recommendations, one quite technical issues about how the HB claim comes together, and the officer who is a member of Torfaen Council prepares your claim. He's recognised that as a small improvement, and the other issue is in relation to an NDR claim. Again, there was a sort of technical issue on that has been addressed, but isn't something that's overly concerning. But other than that, I think we would say it was a good year. Grants are improving, and the council's addressing the actions. But I think looking forward, that's important, because how that feeds through, the more of those actions that become addressed, it reduces our risk assessment, which will feed through to lower days in the future. That's kind of the important aspect of that action plan. There's nothing else I think I need to talk about in detail. The report's pretty self-explanatory. It shows an improving picture and probably just some minor issues, but happy to take questions on the detail.
Can I just
if there are any.
Yeah, can I just invite MCC officers whether they want to talk about aspects of this report, especially the, I think there are some recommendations included in there.
Not really got any issues of substance, other than it's very grateful for Welsh Government for refining the qualification process. It's generally followed on for a couple of years that we've spoken to them about it, and they've said, no, don't worry about that, but given different instructions to the auditors. So it's good that they've actually married that up for this year. In terms of the overall situation, whilst they're looking to be 3 amendments, there's only one of a cash value there, and that's a £9,000 increase on £56,000 worth of audited claims. So I think that's a fairly good result on the year.
You mean 56 million?
6 million. Did I say 56,000?
56 million. Yeah. Okay. Open to the committee then. Councillor Bertrudi.
Just to congratulate the team on a fantastic performance.
Councillor Eason.
Just one query. Is this 10,000 ceiling an aggregate of claims, or is it individual claims? I thought you said it's an aggregate. Is that right?
That's right. It doesn't. If there's an £11,000 adjustment one way offset by 1,000 the other, the figure goes up and not down. You don't net them off. It's a gross figure, yeah.
Councillor Edwards.
Yeah, can we ask the teachers' pensions, whoever does their particular return, to use the correct forms? There's 2 years running, they've used the wrong forms, apparently. It's item 9, actually, on page 18 of the report.
Yeah, I think that's an easy fix.
It doesn't appear to be the second year running.
Yes, Councillor Down.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I noticed that the claims were on time going into the audit office, but there seems to be some delay because of staffing issues there in them reaching wherever they were supposed to reach by the deadline. Can you confirm there was no loss to the council as a result of late submission?
No, there was there were some staffing issues. They actually involved me, and I won't give you any more detail, but it was an unavoidable absence from work on the deadline day itself, or pretty much there. No, there's no loss. What happens if there are late claims? We have a list of stragglers that's sent to all the grants team, and then the manager for the audit would chase up the team to say where's the claim. That I think they were at 3 or 4 days late with WAG, and if there's a consequence, they would come back to us, but there is none. As we know, I should say, WAG are usually a couple of months behind on these sorts of things, and all the claims are into December, so that it's probably the new year they start looking at these things, but there was no consequence on those.
Well, thank you, everyone. I guess then it's for the committee to note the report and any recommendations therein. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the Treasury Management Policy Statement and Strategy Statement. I know that MRP stands for something, but it's escaped me just at the moment. But if I'll just hand it over to Mr. Howcroft to introduce.
Minimum revenue provision, Chair. The committee will be familiar with receiving the monitoring report on a 6-month basis, which actually looks to assess performance against the strategy. This report is probably new to you in giving you the opportunity to influence that strategy before it goes to council. So bearing in mind what your comments are today, that report will be amended if necessary and prove to be the final version that goes to council at the end of the month there. In terms of any significant items in it, it follows a very similar convention to last year. There's no real changes in terms of the risk profile of the organisation or the counterparties. So we're not proposing to change the investment counterparties recommended or the ceiling amounts for any of the counterparties. And our borrowing vehicles are likely to remain the same as ones that we used through 2015-16. The main issues that most councils are considering as part of their Treasury strategy is around the minimum revenue provision calculation and whether it can, in reviewing that, whether there is any fallout to the revenue account. You will have seen earlier in the cycle this year, we did look at option 3 MRP and brought a specific paper back to you on that. We intend to do the same on the supported borrowing calculation, and that paper is being prepared at the moment, and I anticipate it being with you, if not the next meeting, the one after that. In terms of the detail of this, really the essence of the Treasury Strategy Report is that over the next 35 years or so, there's if I can refer you to the graph in page 42, which pictorially shows that actually up to now we've largely been short-term investing and avoiding any long-term borrowing. It suggests, based on our profile of expenditure for the next 35 years, that we will get into quite a significant period of borrowing. My colleague concluded that this was 38 million in year 35. I think what I need to highlight to the committee is that depending on which year you're talking about over those 35 years, it will go up and come down. There are peaks and troughs, but on average, I anticipate that being about 45 million, and largely as a consequence of things like our future schools initiatives. So you've got a grey area there which shows the level of loans that we've got outstanding long term. You've got 2 lines there, a blue line which is our capital financing requirement. That's not actually the level we borrow at because we use internal borrowing to avoid that. So any cash balances we look to use first before we actually arrange any loans. So the real line to compare is really the red line against the grey area. And the difference between the two, that white area, is the level of borrowing that we will need over the next 35 years. So pictorially, that's quite useful for you to appreciate that we move from a net investment situation where we are presently, albeit short term, to one where we will need to borrow longer term significant amounts of money. And on that point, I'm happy to take any questions.
Councillor Prosser.
This question might be totally irrelevant, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I'm interested in the answer. What happens if we pull out of Europe? How does that affect potential investment returns and interest charges going forward? Because we're talking about a long time in the future here, aren't we? And I'm just curious, are we cognizant of that, and are there threats associated with it?
Yes, if I could accurately predict that, I suspect I probably wouldn't be working here. But the reality is it's certainly a volatility going forward. I mean, a number of businesses on the FTSE have said that they see this as being a situation that they think will be disadvantageous. I'm trying to think back to our investment counterparties, and I don't think there are any big investment fund holders within Europe that wouldn't be available to us anyway. I mean, we can invest currently in Sweden, we can invest on the continent, and just because we pull out of Europe doesn't necessarily mean that those investment houses wouldn't be taking our investments. What might actually change is our appetite to risk and our appetite to put in money elsewhere without the common market providing certain securities around that. But actually we're in a situation where we will be increasingly borrowing money. So it won't be a case of safeguarding our interest going forward. It'll be more about, well, where can we get the best deal from? And I hesitate to suggest it, but I'm not sure that I see the question of pulling out of Europe or otherwise necessarily dependent on our loan raising powers, because we use things like the Public Works Loan Board, which is fairly resilient to those sort of changes.
What's the advice we're getting at the moment on future interest rates for borrowing?
The potential for them is that where any period of volatility occurs, they are likely to go up. They were likely to go up anyway, even without the Europe matter, probably by about 0.5% by this time next year. We will get some advance warning of that. I mean, a lot of the conditions for raising interest rates have already been met, but obviously the Bank of England hasn't raised interest rates at the moment. The reason for that is a lot of the improvement in the economy has been driven very much by credit rather than cash arrangements. So they're probably a little resistant to raise those rates. But the Treasury advisors suggest that actually longer term you can be looking for about a 1.5% ultimately increase in rates into the longer term.
I just wanted to make the point that there's a forward look on the interest rate situation, and we get advice on that. Councillor Down is the next person who had a
thank
query.
you. First of all, on the last question, Mark rightly points out that some, I think about a third of FTSE 100 companies have said they're against withdrawal, which leaves 2/3 who either haven't given an opinion or are in favour of it. And looking forward to 2035, I don't think anyone can look forward with any sort of accuracy in, out, or shaking it all about. My question concerns an investment which I understand the authority is intending to make in a company called SkuTrade. And I'd just like to know how that fits in with the strategy which is in front of us.
It's not actually part of our Treasury management strategy. The Treasury management strategy is about our policy for investing any surplus cash balances or borrowing. My understanding of the SkuTrade matter was that there was a report that went to Cabinet to invest £90,000 in a product that SkuTrade were developing on behalf of businesses. That funding was one which was taken out of reserves rather than it being pertaining to investment in the treasury management sense. I don't know whether that helps explain it or whether I've confused even further, but it's not one of our counterparties that we regard for investing our cash balances with the council. It was a specific project that was brought as a separate paper to the members and financed by reserve funding.
Surely, Chairman, whether it's reserve funding or any other funding, it comes out of the cash which, one way or another, the council holds.
Yes, now I can appreciate what you're saying, but it's not one of our investment counterparties for the purposes of performance, etc. I mean, what we do is we look at all our costs and all our income in deciding whether we invest or need to borrow. So, for instance, we may very well have a big capital project that takes off. We don't generally borrow money for specific projects. We'll look at what money we need on the day there as to whether we're getting sufficient council tax or NNDR payments in, or even grant payments that aren't related to that. We net off the two and we look at the borrowing in a very holistic fashion. So when we talk about specific initiatives like SKU Trade, it's not something that pertains to Treasury management other than it's £90,000 worth of a spend that needs to be financed ultimately.
So just so I can be clear, Chairman, sorry to keep coming back on this, it's regarded more as an expenditure than an investment.
Yes.
That's what I thought it was sounding like too. Yeah. Councillor Petrini?
That's interesting. That's very interesting. So it's sold as an investment. My perennial question, and Mr. Howcroft knows probably where I'm going to go with this, but I'll ask it anyway. Given interest rates by own Treasury management are saying that it's going to go up, or they expect it to go up, they can't know for sure, obviously, but at least a half percentage point. Is there not an argument where then you could say we do long-term borrowing now, fix it now, with the view that interest rates are as low as they can go, fix the borrowing now before, you say we get advance warning of interest rate increase, but you know as well as I do, usually markets and other organisations that loan out money fix the price in as soon as they hear any wind of interest rate increases to do a long-term borrowing now, given we have to do it anyway. So give some sort of security in the long-term, medium to long-term, rather than think short-term and less focus on internal borrowing, as it were.
You're absolutely right. That's the traditional way you would look at treasury management, but the market's really strange. A longer-term money costs you more to borrow than short-term at the moment, which wouldn't be the more traditional arrangement of doing it. If you enter into a long-term commitment to borrow and repay money, it's generally at a lower rate historically than what it would be if you borrow the money short-term. But we're in the situation where we're borrowing money short-term at 0.5%, where an equivalent 25-year loan is about 3.5%. So you've got about 3% worth of interest rate change before it makes it sensible to lock yourself into long term. And every advice we've got is that the interest rate changes whilst there will be an upward trend. It will A, be very gradual, and B, we will get a lot of warning prior to it happening.
On the 3.5%, I accept your argument. That's weird the market's doing that. But on 3.5%, surely the long-term interest rates will go up anyway when the interest rates go up. So wouldn't it, it's not going to stay at 3.5% long-term if interest rates go up. So wouldn't it still be more beneficial if we have to borrow the money anyway to fix them now as low as they are now? I know it's short-term is still much, much cheaper. I appreciate that. So there's a short-term gain in that. But given we have to borrow the money anyway, and given that those long-term interest rates will go up in the future, are we not better off fixing them now at 3.5%?
Well, they'll go up in a linear fashion. Your short-term borrowing will go up and your long-term will go up. The decision you've got at the moment is whether I fix now and pay the cost to carry that's 3.5% interest, or whether I borrow and keep my costs of borrowing low at 0.5%. And actually at the moment, it makes a lot more sense to borrow short term, keep repaying it, borrow short term, because effectively your annual cost of borrowing then is only 0.5%, really negligible. It actually accords very closely with what we get when we invest short term. So we've got a very effective cost to carry at the moment.
And we're acting also on advice from the Treasury advisors, are we not? To back that up, so But it is, I think it is a judgment call to an extent.
It is a judgment call, and when we get into the situation of having to borrow long term, there will be a proportion of that money that will go out and carry on being short-term money, and there'll be a proportion that will be long-term, because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. But actually at the moment, if you look at the revenue monitoring, we're deriving some beneficial savings through our treasury management and borrowing short-term against what our estimates were, which would be a mixture of short-term and long-term. So it provides a very favourable effect at the moment, and we know that we'll get some advance warning for consideration as to whether we decide to fix longer term and still get a benefit from it.
Okay, but I know we've got a number of... sorry. I know we've got a number of councillors now who want to ask questions. I just wondered if there is anything which is a continuance of that particular issue about the investment decision. If not, I'll go to Councillor Eason.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it is linked in that, in as much as in December we as a council agreed for you to go down the annuity route on long-term borrowing. Yet on the basis of discussions, was that the most prudent decision? I'm not saying it was the wrong decision, the most prudent decision, on the basis of what sort of levels of borrowing would you be looking to take on the annuity route as opposed to those on a short-term 0.5% route?
Right. Can I make a distinction? The report you saw in December was around changing our calculation for the minimum revenue provision. The minimum revenue provision is a product of what we borrow. What we decided to do in December as a council was that we changed from a straight line basis to an annuity basis, recognising that the long-term interest in these assets meant that current council taxpayers were paying proportionately more to pay off the charges on our assets and our borrowing than they would do into the future. That's why we moved to an annuity rate. It has very little to do with the actual borrowing and borrowing rates per se, because the way that it's shown in the accounts, our borrowing and our treasury costs come forward into the revenue accounts in two fashions. A, the interest that we gain on investments, or in terms of the minimum revenue provision against capital expenditure. We don't actually show the interest on the borrowing in the statement of accounts. So the two are related, but not as directly related as you perhaps might perceive.
Councillor Jordan.
Well, it was a theoretical question really relating to inflation. And I think it's sort of a crystal ball question. If the level of borrowing is represented by the shaded area on the graph, at the moment there is effectively no inflation within the economy. When do you start taking, well, presumably if and when inflation takes off, the whole mechanism and theory of borrowing will change commensurate with the level of inflation.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge with any long-term forecast. I mean, what I would say is that the longer you plan for, the more nebulous some of your assumptions actually are in terms of inflation and interest rates. What I can be reasonably assured is that the annual position is extremely accurate. The medium-term financial position, which covers the next 4 to 5 years that members see, is reasonably accurate. And then after that, there are general assumptions around inflation that, as you say, aren't significant at the moment because inflation is bumping along at around about zero. But so how it will manifest itself really is in the annual predictions of what our capital expenditure will be. But we generally regard our largest single capital expenditure for the next 4 or 5 years being the Future Schools Initiative, and we're fairly certain of what our envelope and our costs are for that.
Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. As councillors, we recently had a paper, I can't remember whether it was at the Audit Committee or Economy and Development Committee, from Deb Hill-Howells and Ben Winstanley, where they were proposing to borrow quite large sums of money to invest it into properties which would provide an income from the rental from those properties. They talked about trying to maximise this, so there was no upper limit on the amount of borrowing that they were talking about. Was that paper taken into account on the amount that you required for the Treasury? And if not, could you explain why not? I know it doesn't, you treat it in a different way, don't you, for that sort of borrowing?
It should ultimately be part of that, because obviously any expenditure on those sorts of assets or investments will be treated as through the capital programme. So it will form part of our costs that will need to be financed. The safeguard to members is that there will need to be a business case that goes alongside any such recommendations to members that demonstrates that actually this is a safe decision that pays for itself. In other words, the income that's derived from these is more than sufficient to offset its borrowing costs. So when you look at it in relation to the overall Treasury strategy, it's not introducing a disparity that needs to be financed. They will be treated on by single decisions, really. It comes back to Councillor Petruni's suggestion year before last in the budget round in terms of saying, well, actually, if you looked more pragmatically at what assets are out there and whether they could derive a resource for the council, then Deb's put a paper together to say, yes, there are some assets out there that you might actually meet that definition. But it's very difficult for me to predict over the next 35 years what those assets will be, what their costs will be, to be able to factor them into these scenarios. What I'm reasonably assured is that when I get details of what they are likely to be in terms of an annual budget, that will feature in the medium-term financial plan and the annual considerations, and certainly the short-term nature of it will be captured. But just for clarification, they're not in the graphs here yet because we haven't had any detail of that fleshed out in terms of amounts.
Okay, any more questions or points? Yes, Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, it's just one, and I noticed that our investment advisors, they due to retender their services for the next financial year and for some years after. When will we know that those successful tender is going to be?
That paper is going to individual cabinet member decision this month, so it will be on circulation and consultation, I believe, by tomorrow.
So it follows on, then we'll be notified of that in the next agenda.
Councillor Petrini.
Just on that point, will we get a breakdown of the criteria used to pick the preferred?
It is in the cabinet members' report that you can see that.
Right, well, we were asked to review the paper prior to it going to cabinet, so I can take it that we've done that. So thank you very much, everyone. The next item I've got in the agenda is the work programme. I believe that the work programme after next April's meeting is dependent on the calendar being agreed for for all the council business. So we just got that. We've just got the work programme for April. But it's not an agenda item here. But we note from the work programme that our next meeting of the Audit Committee will be on the 21st of April. Yes, Councillor.
Chairman, you might not be aware of this, but during the council, I think it was in December, it was realised that some of the budget mandates weren't going to hit expected revenue or savings. And so a new paper was produced to compensate for that, as it were. So about making new savings and detailing them more. I wonder if such a paper, if the consequences of that paper, what happened to those mandates, would come to this